Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is the end of Reconstruction, and here are your objectives. There's a lot of them. Pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab and take some notes. Make sure that you have your vocab sheet in front of you before you continue. In the last lesson, we looked at the period of Reconstruction, which was the time right after the Civil War, lasting for 12 years from 1865 to 1877. Reconstruction was a time of incredible change during which African Americans gained near equality with whites. Yesterday, you learned about the three amendments called the Reconstruction Amendments that were passed during this period. Today, I want to look at some other successes of Reconstruction and then explain why and how Reconstruction ultimately failed. One of the big successes of Reconstruction was the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, a government agency that gave freedmen political and economic assistance. For example, agents working for the Freedmen's Bureau traveled around the South, helping freedmen know and exercise their rights. Ex-Confederates did not want former slaves to have those rights, so the Freedmen's Bureau worked against a lot of hostility and danger. Nevertheless, it worked hard to help register African Americans to vote and allow them to exercise the other rights that they had been granted by the Reconstruction Amendments. Another successful legacy of Reconstruction are what are called historically black colleges and universities, also called HBCUs. HBCUs are institutions of higher education in the South that were established for African Americans during Reconstruction. A few of the more famous HBCUs include Howard University in Washington, D.C., and Morehouse and Clark Universities in Atlanta. Okay, now we're going to shift and look at some of the failures of Reconstruction. The main obstacle to Reconstruction was the fact that the people in power had competing goals for what they hoped to achieve during this period, and it was impossible for all of them to get their way. Let's look at the different groups and their different goals. The first group were called moderate Republicans. The leader of the moderate Republicans was Abraham Lincoln. In 1865, a Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln, and Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, became the next president. Both Lincoln and Johnson wanted reconciliation with former Confederates, which meant that their main goal was to reunite the North and South and have Northerners and Southerners get along again. They did not want to punish Confederates, including the Confederate leaders. The second group was the Radical Republicans, and the leaders of the Radical Republicans were Charles Sumner, who you last saw being beaten into a coma by Preston Brooks back in the 1850s, and this man, Thaddeus Stevens. Both Sumner and Stevens were dedicated abolitionists who believed that the most important goal of Reconstruction was securing equality for freedmen. They did not trust the ex-Confederates, and they thought if the Confederates were not punished, they would go back to treating freedmen as second-class citizens. The Radical Republicans were completely opposed to the moderate Republicans' plan of reconciliation. In particular, the Radical Republicans believed that land should be taken from ex-Confederates and given to freedmen so that the freedmen could start their own farms and be independent. Sumner and Stevens requested that 40 acres of land and a mule be provided to every family of freedmen in the South. The third group was the Southern Democrats. This was the party of the ex-Confederates, the white Southerners. The Southern Democrats' main goal was something called home rule, and that meant that the federal government would leave them alone and allow each southern state to make its own rules, just as it had before the Civil War. Remember, after the Civil War, Northern soldiers were stationed throughout the South, and each state was under the control of the military. For Southern Democrats, the first step in achieving home rule was having those Northern soldiers leave. All right, take a moment and compare the goals of these three groups. As you might have noticed, the goals of the Southern Democrats were completely at odds with the goals of the radical Republicans. There was no way that African Americans would get equality if the white Southerners were left alone to make their own decisions and rules. This was the tension that defined Reconstruction. For 12 years, the radical Republicans were in charge, and freedmen made huge gains toward equality. But then came the election of 1876. The last term is the Compromise of 1877, and it was the deal that ended Reconstruction. Here's what happened. In 1876, there was an extremely close election, and the Democrats and the Republicans could not agree on who won. So in order to decide the winner, the Democrats and the moderate Republicans made a deal, and this deal was called the Compromise of 1877. Here's what the compromise said. First, the Republicans would win the election, and the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, would get to be the next president. So this was a win for the Republicans, or at least the moderate Republicans. But in exchange, the Democrats had to get something too, and what they got was home rule. And that meant that the federal government would remove the troops from the South and stop enforcing equal rights for black people. In other words, in exchange for a Republican becoming president, the Democrats, the white people in the South, would get to govern their states the way they wanted without the federal government or any troops telling them what to do. There would no longer be any troops making sure that the freedmen were getting their rights. Sadly, the Republicans accepted the deal. They got reconciliation from the South and the chance to have their candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, become president. But in exchange, they gave up on protecting the rights of black people in the South, and those black people quickly lost the rights that they had gained during Reconstruction. 1877 was the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of a very dark time for African Americans. We call this time period the Jim Crow era. It was a period of legalized discrimination in the U.S. Look at these dates. The Jim Crow era lasted a very long time, all the way until the 1960s. We'll learn more about that period in the next lessons. All right, it's time to review the objectives. Oops. If you don't know the answer to any of them, rewind the video and look again. I will see you in class. Bye, students.